webinar. Our webinar is called the Tri-State Dairy Exchange, and the topic or theme for this year is navigating the future of dairy. As folks log on, I'll just quickly add that we have some upcoming webinars as well that you can look forward to. So next month, we'll have Dr. Verkler from Cornell talking about milk quality. So tune in to that one. And then in October, we have a webinar that'll be discussing transition cow health. Just so you know, you can use the QR code on the screen to register. And then as a reminder, all of our webinars are recorded and posted on YouTube, and you can find those at UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils Program. So I'll wait just a few more minutes for folks to get logged on, and then we'll start our program today. All right, so I think I'll get things started so we can do our introductory slides. So for today's topic, we're going to be talking about calf and heifer management, and Sarah and I actually are going to be the presenters today because we are and still in the process of wrapping up a project that we did with farmers in Maine and New Hampshire regarding this topic. So as a reminder, the Tri-State Dairy team, our mission consists of trying to advance dairy management and address challenges and foster innovation within the northern New England states, including Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, which is why our team is comprised of specialists in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. So myself in Maine, Sarah in New Hampshire, and Whitney and Amber in the state of Vermont. Be sure to tune in to in-person and events in the upcoming months. So we still have some in August, but we have some in September as well. So New Hampshire, Sarah added that there'll be a silvopasture twilight meeting in Stratham. I hope I said that right. Sarah's also running a cohort project on value added, so be sure to message her about for more information on that. And we're going to be talking about our cohort project today, and I think it's a really great way to interact with other farmers as well as interact with a technical assistance provider. In Maine, we always release new Farmcast episodes every Wednesday, so you can find that on all podcast platforms. And we're hosting a pasture walk next Thursday at Mayday Farm in Leeds, Maine. So we'll be talking about technologies, we'll be talking about solar energy and some forages. And then Whitney or Amber, would you like to let us know what's happening in Vermont?
Sure, yeah. Coming up tomorrow, UVM Extension in collaboration with independent consultants Sarah Flack and Cheryl Cesario, as well as independent nutritionist Bill Kipp, will meet at the Miller Farm in Vernon, Vermont to discuss strategies for producing high quality forage, both for stored feed and in a pasture system. Also, how shifting climate patterns are affecting plant dormancy and how cutting height influences forage yield and quality. Managing soil fertility, and Heather will be there. Heather Darby will be there to discuss the results from this year's Northwest Crops and Soils Program's forage variety trials. The Miller Farm milks around 200 cows on 700 acres. It's organically managed and certified in Vernon. Registration is required, but there's still a few spots left. Also tomorrow, or today actually, there is a neonic BMP rule public hearing. The Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets has been facilitating these public hearing opportunities across the state. So if you grow corn or if you work with folks that do, these meetings may be of interest to you. There's 2 hearing dates remaining in this series. One is this afternoon in St. Albans, and the other is next week in Brattleboro. And you can register and learn more about both of these events by visiting the conferences and events page on the UVM Extension Northwest Crops and Soils website, which I will drop into the chat shortly here. Thanks.
Great. And then additionally, we've started featuring some podcasts that we think could provide valuable knowledge to our listeners. So if you haven't tuned into the Dairyland Initiative podcast, it's led by folks at the University of Wisconsin. And the Dairyland Initiative podcast really they talk a ton about environment, infrastructure, and a bunch of other topics, but really around barn design and management and then cow comfort. So it has really good information there, and I recommend that folks look it up and tune into some of the episodes. So, oh, that's funny. It went into the podcast episode. So, and now it's stuck there. Sorry, guys, we're having some technical difficulty. There we go. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about calf and heifer management and specifically our project that we're doing in the state of Maine and Vermont. And I kind of wanted to start with the sort of the four areas on the farm where I potentially see are the main focus areas for calf and heifer management. And so I broke it up into four because we sometimes forget about the maternity period and stage, but that's really critical into impacting how our calves grow and thrive during their first year of life. Additionally, if we get our colostrum management correctly, we can improve the potential of the calf's life to remain on the farm. Similar to nutrition and paying attention to our feeding equipment. And then lastly, we always think about the environment that the calves are in. And really, the goal of all of this is to make sure that the calf, and specifically female calves, can become a 2-year-old and enter the lactation string in 2 years. So we're going to go into each of these quadrants in the next couple of slides. And I put resources for you at the bottom. So if you want to go learn more about these specific things, because we're just going to sort of touch surface level on a lot of these things. But if you have more questions about each of them, please reach out to Sarah and I, or Whitney and Amber, of course, and we can help you sort of fine tune and think about some of these on your farm. So when thinking about the maternity pen and dry period, some of the things that are important to consider is that that calf's going to grow the most during late gestation or the last trimester of that cow's pregnancy. So what happens in that last trimester can really impact the ability of that calf to thrive in those first couple of months, even before they are weaned. So there's a lot of good research indicating that heat stress during the dry period can actually have potentially negative outcomes in terms of reduced immunity and body weight. So the ability of that calf to grow during the first couple of months of life. So there's been a lot of discussion about, improving heat abatement in the dry pen. And additionally, during that time, and to reduce transition disorders, which is really critical to both the calf and to the dam, we want to make sure that cows are at a body condition score of around 3 to 3.5. We don't want them to lose weight and we don't want them to put on weight. So we want to maintain them right at that optimal range. There's a lot of data supporting the fact that rumen-protected choline can actually help improve colostrum production as well as milk yield and reduce transition disorders. So this is something to look into if you haven't already. And on the topic of colostrum, I feel like we talk about this colostrum all the time, but when we think about colostrum, it's providing antibodies to the calf from the dam. If not, you can feed colostrum replacer. So it's really critical that the cows are vaccinated so that they can actually pass on those antibodies to the calf through the colostrum. And then, of course, in this sort of calving time, we want to try to minimize as much interaction with manure, especially for those herds that might potentially have yonis. And then just consider if your dry period is optimal for you or not. Is it too short? Is it too long? And trying to stay within that benchmark of what makes sense for you. But a recommended range is 45 to 60 days, and that's going to impact colostrum yield and the ability of that cow to sort of heal and go into her lactation as ready as she can. As I mentioned, I'm going to cover colostrum briefly again, but I think it's really important. We have sort of the three Qs that we think about: quantity, quality, and quickly. So in this first slide, I have up here quantity. So calves should be getting at least 10% of their body weight in colostrum. And so that can look like, very differently from farm to farm. Sometimes farms split it up into, two quarts at a feeding. And so that's 4 quarts at least that they're getting in their first feeding of colostrum. It's really critical that they're getting enough. But quality is super important because, again, like I mentioned, the calves don't have immunity. They're born without immunity, and they're going to develop immunity as they get exposed to pathogens in the first 2 months of life. So because they don't have immunity, this is really their first method of defense is colostrum that has antibodies in it. So we want to make sure that we're meeting that minimum of 50 grams per liter of IgGs. And you can use a refractometer as a way to measure if the colostrum quality is optimal or not. And of course, temperature is important. So we don't want to surpass 140 degrees Fahrenheit if we're actually thawing colostrum that's frozen. And the reason why that's really important is because if you think about an egg, when you cook an egg, it's going to change the form of that egg from liquid to solid. And so what we're doing with colostrum when we're thawing it at a really high temperature is we're making it into something that is no longer in the same form of absorption that the calf's going to be able to retain. So we're cooking the colostrum if we're doing it at a really high temperature. That egg analogy always is in the back of my mind when we think about colostrum. And it's really important that we feed colostrum because, like I mentioned, we want to get those antibodies until that calf has active immunity on their own. But that's why we must feed colostrum really quickly. And on this graph here, we have on the y-axis the percent immunoglobulin absorption, and then on the x-axis we have the hours after birth. It's really recommended right away as quickly as we can because as the calves grow in age in this 24-hour mark, their ability to absorb those bigger proteins that are in the colostrum is going to be reduced because their intestines are going to sort of close and so there's not going to be absorption of those proteins as we get closer to the 24-hour mark. So that's why we want to hit them within, I'd say 8 hours or less, so that we are actually getting that high quality colostrum into the calf, and they're actually able to absorb that and have that immunity until they're able to uh, protect themselves on their own. And one of the ways you can sort of measure and assess what your colostrum program is right now is with record keeping. And you can use record keeping for a multitude of things, but there's an example of how to keep the records so we understand, if we have a health event further down the line or if this animal comes into lactation and has issues, this is a really good way to note back, this was tied to this or this was tied to that. This is really simple. You can use whatever works for you. And we actually have a fact sheet. So there's a QR code. We wrote a fact sheet that has more information about how to do this based on recommended guidelines. So as equally important is that our feeding equipment, whether it's for our colostrum harvesting bucket or a colostrum feeding equipment, or our bottles and whether you have a calf feeder or whatever equipment you're using to feed calves, it's really important that we follow uh, 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 a protocol for cleaning because if our calves are drinking, pathogens that weren't cleaned appropriately because our temperature might be off or our sanitizer that we're using or our alkaline agent detergent that we're using was not the right pH, that can obviously harbor bacteria and then that calf is going to be utilizing that, that feeding equipment that has that bacteria. So here's an example of a protocol that you can follow. There's many out there. This is just an example that was really easy to follow, and it was also translated in Spanish for those folks that have Spanish-speaking employees. As I had mentioned, we want to make sure that we understand that our feeding equipment does not have built-up organic matter because they can harbor bacteria and other pathogens. And so we want to make sure that our equipment is clean and dry as well. We can use a tool that's called an ATP meter, which can measure light and the more organic matter that's present on a surface, the higher relative light unit. So if the surface is not cleaned effectively, a higher RLU reading will indicate that we have to potentially reassess our cleaning protocol. But this is a tool. It's not going to, for example, tell you what kind of bacteria are growing in our fitting equipment. It's just going to assess whether your cleaning protocol is working or not. And I've mentioned briefly that we want to make sure we are developing our rumen with all of these management practices and specifically with our nutrition. I'm going to go a little bit into that in a second, but this chart here is to represent that calves are not born with a functional rumen. And so during, especially during the first 2 months of life, they're relying on their abomasum to get most of their nutrients processed within before it goes into the intestines, and so that's how they're gonna process our milk. And the abomasum is similar to our true stomach, but as they grow, they're gonna build their rumen, and so it becomes a larger percentage of their body as well. And so once they're mature, the rumen's gonna take up most of the space within their compartments, and in addition, it's gonna be where all of the energy is gonna be transformed into something that they can utilize. So that's why it's critical that we sort of ensure the nutrition is meeting our benchmark for developing that rumen, because it becomes the main way that they utilize nutrients in the future. So pre-weaning, we want to again think about at least meeting 10% of the body weight in milk, because this is going to be their main source of energy. Calves that are fed ad libitum milk, they can consume up to 20% of their body weight. But this just gives you a range. And so if we're meeting that 10% minimum, that's going to put us at around 4 to 9 quarts daily for an 100-pound Holstein calf. But as I mentioned, starter is really where it helps us develop that rumen. Starter in water. And starter can be introduced by day 3. Day 5 may be optimal for you as well. It should contain higher percentage protein, and that's because if you think about what a calf is doing during this stage, it's growing, and so we have higher protein demands because that calf is going to need to put on more body weight, and it's going to have to grow in their skeletal system. So starter and grains, specifically the fermentation of grain within that compartment, so the 4 compartments that the ruminants have, and specifically with butyrate, which is a result of fermentation of grain of the volatile fatty acids. Butyrate helps us to stimulate production of the papillae, which help us absorb our nutrients. And I think of papillae as sort of like our carpet. So they look like these villi structures, and so they're going to be where in the rumen, if you think about, sometimes people say like the rumen mat's like a carpet, it's going to be where the calves eventually are going to be able to absorb those feedstuffs when they become mature. So butyrate really stimulates the production of those papillae, and so it's really critical that they get grain for this to happen. And there's other cool pictures about different ways to feed calves, but starter grain can really help us set the calf up right. As a reminder, we want to be meeting that twice the body weight of the calf's birth at weaning. And then for weaning, to minimize some of the stressors that they're going to experience, some folks want to meet that benchmark of the calves at least eating 2 pounds of starter per day for 3 days, so that that calf can then transition from a predominantly liquid diet to a solid diet. We're going to talk about water and some of the challenges we've actually seen farmers experience here, and especially in the winter months. But water is so important for calves because it helps stimulate feed intake. But not only that, it's really where a lot of our nutrients are transported within our bodies. So water is critical, and of course, our bodies are made up of a large percentage of water. But one of the things that you can potentially do if freezing is happening on your farm in the winter is feed warm water right after you feed that calf, or between feedings, but feeding a little bit of warm water because it improves the feed intake, and as well, like I mentioned, it has other essential body functions. And then something that can potentially help you have a smoother transition during the weaning period is if you implement less than one change per week. So that might look like they're going into a whole new group of calves they've never seen. That's the one change. Change their diet or their feed stuff the following week. Maybe they're going to be eating from a new feeder that they've never been accustomed to. So all of those things can really help you minimize weaning stress, which is always something that happens. But if we remember, those calves were growing really well up to the weaning period, and we don't want to see that slump in their growth for a couple of weeks as they sort of transition and come back to, increase that growth. But we want to minimize that slump in growth as much as we can. Additionally, after the weaning period, we can start transitioning them from starter to grower, which is just going to have a lower protein requirements. But high quality forage is really where we're going to want to focus on in this period. So before weaning, forage isn't really the main source of feed. It's going to be that grain and that milk. But once we transition, the animal now is better able to absorb and actually break down the feed stuff. So forage is going to be something that they're actually going to be able to take energy from. And you can feed them fermented forages starting at 16 weeks. So you can introduce that to them because the rumen is going to be starting to have more function. But we want to have average daily gain around 1.7 to 2 pounds per day. And of course, meeting that breeding weight guideline and benchmark. We want to minimize overcrowding as much as we can. And then using artificial insemination, which most folks are doing, but I just wanted to make a point that our youngest animals on the farm tend to have the highest genetics and genetic potential. So we're always going to, improve based on those animals, and that's going to be our heifers. So here are some benchmarks that I just wanted to highlight. I really think each farm should create their own because it's going to be really variable. So as a part of this project, each of the farms, we calculated and we recorded what the mature body weight for that farm was, which were cows that were at least in third lactation or higher. And then we made our time points based off of that mature body weight. So that included what should the first lactation animals be in that first month of life for body weight, and then what should the breeding weight be for the animals within that herd. And that's really critical because it's going to vary farm by farm. But we know that heifers cost roughly around $2,500 from the time they're born to the time that they're a 2-year-old and entering the lactation string, with most of that cost happening in the weaning, the pre-weaning period. Sometimes folks really want to hit the benchmark at 22 to 24 months of age for age at first calving, so that we can try to make some of that money as quickly back as we can. As I mentioned, make your benchmark, but in general, we want to reach 55% of our mature body weight at first conception. And for Jerseys and Holsteins, I have some guidelines here, but make your own benchmarks and then sort of, make sure your animals are growing based on your mature body weights in your herd. And then they should be at 85% of mature weight at first calving. And additionally, there's some really good data out of Wisconsin and the University of Florida and Penn State indicating that there's sort of this optimum for body weight at first calving and maturity rate at first calving, where we don't have these outliers that have increased potential to be culled. So if our first lactation heifers have too much condition and way too much in that first month of lactation, they're going to lose a lot of body weight, potentially go into negative energy balance, and that's not going to set them up right for their first lactation. So they're an outlier, they're at risk of getting culled. And then similarly, our animals that are really light coming into that first lactation, they're going to have to put on a lot of weight. And so they're just always going to be trying to catch up. So we have this sort of optimum maturity rate, and it can be anywhere from potentially 70 to 85% of the maturity rate of your, again, mature cows. But so we want our heifers to not lose a lot of weight and not have to put on a lot of body weight because they're still growing in that first lactation. And so if they're having to put a lot of the energy towards growing instead of milk production, that can be, a potentially negative outcome for their lifetime performance. And then lastly, I just wanted to put this up here as in case folks wanted a reference point. But please work with your veterinarian on your vaccine protocols, not only for your calves, but for all of your other age groups. But just something to keep in mind. A lot of folks focus on the respiratory issues that they have within the first 2 months of life. So you're going to see folks hitting calves with your respiratory and your viral pathogens. And then on the breeding side, as we come up to breeding, it's just important to consider that some vaccines are not recommended when that heifer is pregnant because they can potentially lead to abortion. So just keep that in mind. And then, of course, this is going to help your colostrum quality and that calf's antibodies and its ability to have better immunity to start off that next stage of life. So this dry period management also impacts the calf's life. So this is just a reference point, but please work with your veterinarian on your vaccine protocols. And with that, I'm going to transfer it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Glenda. So Glenda did a really good job of going through like a lot of the background and why we were looking at this project. So Glenda and I worked together over the past year and a half, working with farmers in New Hampshire and Maine to implement strategies to improve their calf and heifer management. So we formed two cohorts, one in New Hampshire and one in Maine, where we were working one-on-one with farms to develop or to evaluate their current program, develop some goals, and hopefully make a management change, and we can evaluate the impact of that. And so those one-on-one meetings with farmers were really farm dependent, and so they looked a little bit different after our initial assessment. Another thing that we're working with farms on now is for the farms that want to participate, we're trying to calculate the cost of production for raising a calf until they are a 2-year-old. The cost of production for raising heifers is one of the leading expenses on dairy farms. And so understanding your costs is essential to making some of these management decisions to make sure that you're getting the return on investment that you need. And so these farmer cohorts, not only did they work one-on-one with us, but we also did meetings at each of the cohort locations. So each farm hosted a meeting, and that gave them a chance to see the other farms that were in the cohort and work with each other and learn from each other, ask a lot of questions. We may have had a theme for each of these meetings, but really these meetings became very farmer-led. Our goal was to let them learn from each other. And these meeting themes were based on farmer feedback and based on what we were seeing in these individual meetings that we were having with farms, and maybe some of the topics that we might want to hit on and just have a little bit of a resource developed for. And we also wanted a chance to, just continue our work together to build a more multi-state extension program. You know, New England has very few resources dedicated to each individual state, and so it's essential for us to be able to share expertise. And part of that is for us to take a survey of New England dairy farmers so that we can understand some of those future educational needs. So like I said, one of the first things that we did was evaluated the farm's current management programs. That included auditing some of their sanitation practices that I'll talk about later. But the first thing that we did was really just get an idea of where their calves were as far as their growth development. So we took growth measurements, body scale measurements, weights and heights, and we plotted the weights and heights on growth curves. And so here we've got the initial measurement of all of the Jersey cows that were enrolled in the study, or all of the Jersey calves, sorry, that were enrolled in the study. And this is plotted against or compared to the data that Penn State has available from the early 2000s. And so this gave farms an idea of where their calves were standing up relative to national recommendations or the national averages. And just putting a plug out there, because, you know, these scales may change over time, it's really important that we continue to improve the data. Like I said, this data is still very valuable, but it's also from the early 2000s. And so whenever we were looking at that, we had to keep that in mind, that things may not quite equate to what they were today. And so it's important that we continue to add to that database so that we can give more accurate information to farmers. So you can see jerseys were doing pretty well. They were pretty consistent. We saw a little bit more variability in our Holsteins, especially as they got older. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we found whenever we were evaluating the actual heifer programs too, but that was one of the first things that we saw. Now, this isn't the end all be all. This is looking at national averages. So one of the things that we also did was we built a growth curve based on that specific farm, which we're not going to share here just to protect farm information. But we took measurements of their mature cows so that we could see where their calves and heifers were growing relative to their farm size. So that really gives people a better idea of what growth metrics or whether or not they're hitting the growth metrics that Glenda talked about earlier. So one of the other things that we did was we did a sanitation audit. So Glenda mentioned, some of the key things for cleaning, and we were able to evaluate how well different pieces of equipment were cleaned using an ATP meter. This tool is not something that's meant to swab something that looks dirty or test something that looks dirty. It's really meant to test something that looks clean to see if we are getting things as clean as it appears. So one thing that we found is that most farms had at least one area to improve on as far as their sanitation protocol. And I'll show you some of the ranges from the first test on the next slide, but some of the most common things that we saw or nipples are really hard to clean, particularly like the peach teat nipples. They're just really hard to get a really good way to get all of the like milk residue out of there. Colostrum collection equipment is like notoriously one of the dirtier spots. Sometimes it's sitting out in a milk house or in your parlor and open air, and sometimes that's just one of the hardest ones to keep clean. Buckets get scratched, they get older bottles that haven't been replaced in a while. Those are harder to get clean. And so we saw that without a really good protocol in place, it was easy for those to be pretty high, and particularly buckets with handles, because those handles are really hard to get a scrub brush into and to get that really clean. And so that's why you see some of these wild ranges a little bit. Almost, it wasn't uncommon on each farm for us to have at least one number that was in the thousands. So our recommendations for this ATP meter is that anything that's going into like milk equipment for a calf that's already gotten colostrum should be less than 50. And anything that's being used for colostrum, bottles, tubes, colostrum collection equipment, if anything else like that, nipples, those should be less than 20. Because it's really essential that that's our cleanest spot on the farm, really. And you'll see that this ranged wildly from really low within, recommendations to the thousands. And this was our first visit. So I've seen buckets now that have tested at 0. But it gave farms a really good idea of where they were at. And most farms have made a substantial improvement in their sanitation programs, and some farms have been reported that they've already had less health incidences because of that. So whenever we were looking at calf nutrition, some of the challenges that we found, and we're really reporting mostly on the challenges. Farms are doing most things extremely well. But some of the challenges that we might have seen on farms are maybe not having a defined feeding program, being a little bit more selective or not mixing milk replacer consistently. That really led to inconsistencies in the feed that the calf was getting that we'll see later on. Right now, the cost of raising animals is extremely expensive. And so one of the ways that farms have cut down on costs is maybe to reduce the cost of their feed or, feeding some lower cost rations just so that they can get feed into them. But that may have restricted some of their calf growth, particularly with like protein sources in the starter, that the cost difference between those can be pretty high. And really, water is always a challenge, especially in the winter. If you're not housing in a calf barn, if they're outside in hutches and you don't have, a line to feed warmed water, that is a really hard thing to keep thawed and not to have it freeze in 5 minutes here in New England. And so if you manage to figure out a way to do that, please let us know, because I think you would make a ton of money just by being able to tell farms about this. It's a challenge. And so farms are constantly battling how they're able to supply that essential nutrient for, months at a time, really. So like I mentioned, sometimes we had some inconsistencies in our calf feeding program, and that really carried into the post-weaning program. So any challenges that we saw whenever they were younger, they may have plotted really well. They may have still grown well when they're in that period where they're growing really rapidly. But as that kind of spaced out later on, they may have health challenges as they're, transitioning during weaning and going into a group pen. If they're not being fed adequately, if they don't have a good plan of nutrition, then you might see that they don't transition well during that time. They get more respiratory issues. Their body can't fight off some of the, you know, ringworm, things like that, that just are opportunistic as well. And then you see some of that inconsistent growth that may come from the health challenges or just the fact that they haven't been fed consistently for the first couple of, months of their life, really. And sometimes farms they really focused on their, pre-weaned calf management, and it was like fabulous, but maybe later on it was a little bit more challenging. We haven't invested as much in facilities, which is a challenge, especially in New England. Maybe we have multiple breeds in one group now, and so it's hard to feed them meeting both animals' needs. And so one of the things that we saw is that even if you did a really great job in that pre-weaned calf management, if you weren't able to tighten up and really specialize some of your later nutrition, and some animals weren't growing well enough. And we were able to see that whenever we looked at their breeding records. They weren't breeding on time. So their, age at first calving was later than we would like it to be. And all that's doing is costing the farm money. So as I mentioned, part of this project is also not only working with the farms and identifying some of these challenges, but also getting an idea of what's going on in New England. We see farms, but is that really representative of what the broader industry is doing in New England? So Glenda and I have been conducting a survey of the calf and heifer management practices in New England, so that we can better understand what those current production practices are, what producer perceptions of, their challenges and their expenses are, what are the goals, the things that, producers are working towards, and what motivates them to make change, and also where producers get information. We're technical service providers, and so our goal is to provide information in a way that farms are going to receive it. So I'm going to present, we're still in the process of collecting data. So if you have farms, we would love to have them participate in the survey as well. But of the farms that have participated thus far, 55% of them reported that they did not know their cost to raise a calf from birth to weaning. And like I said, this is a number that's hard to calculate, but it's essential to at least have some type of benchmark so that we can make these management decisions. And of those that were tracking their cost of production, we had them rank their perceived expenses. And I wasn't surprised that veterinary care was one of the most expensive. I was pretty surprised that farms perceived that feed and like milk or milk replacer was their lowest cost, because for me, especially in my previous life, whenever I was doing nutrition work, that is one of the first areas that's cut to save money. And so that was just interesting that even though that's one of the areas that's oftentimes, challenging to pay for maybe the feed that you would like to give your animals, that wasn't what farms perceived as the most expensive cost, or it was the least expensive of the list that we gave them. So this one didn't surprise me a little bit. So whenever extension agents go out and we ask questions about how they get their information, extension usually ranks pretty lower on the list because we're not on these farms every single day. But it gives us a good idea of who we need to be in contact with and what type of resources are being developed. So the nutritionist is on the farm regularly, and so that's usually one of the first points of contact, as well as like your veterinarian. But farms are looking for resources in their newsletters, and they're going online to find these. And so I think that that's just really important whenever we're thinking about how we can have impact, making sure that we are putting the things that we know into a resource that can be found online at a later date for farms. So Glenda spent a lot of time talking about colostrum because it's so essential. And so we try and do a lot of education around colostrum, but sometimes, making the actual change to make a management practice or to change a management practice can be a little bit tricky. In some regions of the country, pasteurized colostrum is more popular, but here, not many people were pasteurizing colostrum, which was, just kind of important to know whenever we're talking about our colostrum management. And interestingly, I thought about half of the people that responded were feeding fresh colostrum. So whenever I hear that, I'm, thinking more about the timing of colostrum rather than maybe, focusing and dialing in on thawing and reheating practices and, temperature monitoring and stuff. Really focusing on the timing maybe, and keeping, an understanding of that in mind. Farms were doing a pretty good job of that timing though, but I think, whenever half the participants are saying that they usually get it in within 6 hours, but occasionally it's sometimes after that, but it's still within 24 hours. How can we work with farms to develop a strategy to get more people into that always within 6 hours? So records are essential, especially if you want to monitor your, nutrition program, monitor your, costs, monitor your vaccination program. You can't make change. You can't change what you don't know what's happening. You can't make changes if you're not monitoring anything because you won't know if it's actually making an impact. So about half the farms were recording health events, which is fantastic. We would love to see that number increase. It would be really great as well if we can figure out ways to make it feasible for farms and meaningful enough for farms to record weights as well. Because hitting those growth metrics is essential for getting your replacement animals into the herd in a timely manner at the right size so that they can produce in the way that we need them to produce so that they can start paying back the cost of raising them up until that point. And so if there's a way for us to increase that, 9% number of birth and weaning weight so that we can at least get people measuring, body metrics, and that would be really nice. Another thing that was really interesting to me is that traditionally we think of farms and the dairy industry as weaning between 6 to 8 weeks. And while that has been going up, I didn't quite realize just how many farms were weaning after 8 weeks. I had seen it enough, but it was really, really interesting to see that there were more farms weaning later than 12 weeks than there were in the traditional 6 to 8 weeks. So whenever we look at our goals for pre-weaning body weight, and saying doubling your birth size or doubling your doubling your body weight by weaning, maybe that's not quite the standard if we're weaning, twice as long as we were in the past. So those types of goals and metrics that have been in the industry for a long time need to be evaluated within the system as well. And so, like I said, one of our things too as well was just to figure out what was motivating farms. And the majority of farms were really looking for their heifer nutrition program to balance growth and reproductive readiness. And so making sure that when we are working with farms, we are emphasizing and really prioritizing getting them ready for breeding so that they can go back into the herd. And most farms, the majority of farms were using AI, but we still have some that never use AI or only use it periodically, but are using maybe a cleanup bowl. So kind of next steps, like I said, we're in the process of working with farms to calculate their cost of production and specifically their cost per pound of gain per stage of life, so that hopefully we can get some metrics for our region. We've been developing fact sheets along the way. So based on the feedback, the farms have given us feedback on these fact sheets. And we've been using the topics that we've, worked with the farms on to develop these different fact sheets. But using that information to help to continue to lead programs where we try and get more farms to, measure heifer growth rates, and as well as look at their sanitation. Now that we have these tools in the area, we can come and evaluate those on farms that aren't in the project as well. Some of the changes that we've seen from farms that we're looking at, we're still measuring the impact of. We've had farms that have completely changed their milk feeding program, that are changing their heifer feeding program. Almost every farm has improved sanitation. Some farms have started really looking at their thawing or reheating practices and making sure that they're actually temping the water so that it's not getting too hot. And we've actually had one farm say that they did that almost immediately and that alone was worth being a part of this project. And we've also had some farms that have been working with their veterinarian to discuss their health protocols and how they can evaluate it to make sure that it's still meeting their needs. And with that, I want you to, thank you for joining our webinar. I know it was a bit of an interesting one today. Next month, join us. We're going to be talking about troubleshooting milk quality issues with Dr. Paul Verkler of QMPS for a practical approach to identifying and addressing milking equipment issues that impact milk quality and herd health. The webinar will cover how to evaluate equipment problems and strategies for implementing effective solutions, and how to build a system for identifying problems through training and clear communication. And as always, we would love for you to take our survey. And Susan has put that survey in the chat. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. We do have time for questions if folks want to hang around and ask us about anything we presented today, or follow up. I'll put our emails back up if you have further questions. I think that's this one. And if not, that concludes our program today.